What is something rich people buy that poor people know nothing about? My sister used to work at a very expensive hotel in London. She told me that new clients would check in, and then once they left the room, the staff would go in and inventory everything they brought with them, and where they put it and how, with the help of staff, they set the room up. They do this so the next time the client schedules a room, the staff can run out and buy everything on the list so the client doesn't have to have any luggage and everything is set up how they like it. They have thousands of clients, and she showed me pictures of room layouts and lists of clothing, watches, and other things are always set up the same for the same client. Crazy stuff.
That's an interesting way to cater to high-end clients. It makes sense to create a familiar environment for returning guests. I guess it shows how much the hotel values customer satisfaction. I imagine it would take a lot of organization to keep track of all those preferences. It's a bit wild to think about all the personal details they manage just to ensure everything is perfect for each stay.
The Strand, a bookstore in New York, sells books by the foot. Mostly they're encyclopedias, 14th editions, things that aren't of much value, but they have really pretty spines. For making your library look pretty. Just bought a new house with a big, empty library? Just measure the width of the shelves, choose cloth of leather, and a few days later you'll put J. Gatsby to shame.
That's an interesting concept they have at the Strand. Selling books by the foot seems like a clever way to make a library look good without actually needing to read anything. I guess it's more about aesthetics than actual literature. I remember helping a friend decorate his new place, and we ended up buying a bunch of old-looking books just for show. It did make the room feel more sophisticated.
I'm not rich, but etiquette school. I don't remember how the conversation started, but a friend of mine from college started talking to me about etiquette school. I must have given her a questionable look because she immediately paused, looked embarrassed, and said something along the lines of, "Not everyone goes to etiquette school, do they?"
I remember a similar moment with a friend. We were discussing manners at a cafe, and I mentioned how I never really thought about etiquette. She looked at me surprised and said, "It's not like it's a requirement." It was funny seeing her so invested in something I'd never considered important. We laughed about it, and now I sometimes catch myself being more mindful of how I act around others.
Obscure brands of regular items. I have a few well-off friends and trust fund babies, and all of them need obscure brands of regular items. They want potato chips. It can't be Lay's. It has to be an imported thin-cut potato from France that was harvested by the bay on a cool afternoon by a happy French man.
It's funny how some people get fixated on obscure brands for the simplest things. I remember a friend who insisted on only using this specific kind of salt from a tiny island in the Mediterranean. Just regular salt, but he claimed it enhanced everything. We'd laugh about it while eating chips from the store. I guess for some people, it's all about the story or the status rather than just enjoying the snack.
Growing up in the 80s and 90s as a kid, all I remember is that if someone ever owned a refrigerator that had an electric ice maker and served water, I would assume they were rich. The same was said about families with kids that owned Power Wheels or had a cell phone in their car. Shit, how times have changed.
I get that. Back in the day, having certain things really set you apart. I remember thinking my neighbor was living the high life because they had a fancy phone in their car. Now it seems like everyone has that stuff, and what was once considered special is just the norm. It's interesting how perceptions shift over time.
A lot of people have multiple cars, but rich people have cars specifically for the weekend. During the week, you drive your average S-Class / Lexus / 7 Series that you don't mind subjecting to cruel traffic, but from Thursday to Sunday, you drive your weekend car. These fall on 3 spectrums: antiques, sports cars, or luxury cars. I don't know much about the antiques, but I love going for drives in the area on Fridays just to look at the Rolls-Royce Phantoms and Lumbos. Lambo/Ferraris are usually driven by younger rich people, Arabs and athletes, and are seen at night, usually racing. The luxury cars are the old people. Maseratis are not weekend cars, they're work cars. And every Saturday morning, there's a car show in our town. Also banks. If you're rich, you usually are a preferred customer at multiple big-name banks. They know you by name and know your family, and you can give upper-level management personal calls for help.
It's interesting how cars can reflect a lifestyle. I've seen the same thing in my town. On weekends, the streets change. You spot all those flashy sports cars, made for attention. The car shows have a different vibe, too. Everyone gathers to admire the classics and modern luxury. Banks seem to play a role in that world, as well. It's like a whole different universe, just around the corner.
I live in Sydney, Australia, and recently there was a big controversy about how students of two of our most expensive private schools were being secretly guaranteed spots at University of Sydney, one of the major 3 universities in Sydney, before they had even done their Year 12 finals. Everyone else in the state stresses out over Year 12 to get good grades and get a good ATER, equivalent of GPA, and these kids didn't have to lift a finger just because their parents were rich. So there's that.
It's kind of wild how money can change the game, huh? A lot of students are putting in huge effort, and then you have a few who just ride a wave of privilege. I get that it's frustrating for those grinding for good grades. It's a tough situation when fairness gets tossed aside. Makes you wonder about the real value of education and hard work compared to wealth. Just feels off.
I never understood why Forrest Gump always said, "Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get." Every box of chocolates I've ever seen comes with a handy little diagram that tells you exactly what you're going to get. I joked about this with a friend once, and they informed me that this was just a poor people thing. High-end chocolates don't generally come with a diagram.
That's an interesting take. I guess it makes sense that higher-end chocolates are meant to be a surprise. I remember trying a fancy chocolate box once. No clue what I was biting into, and some were really weird flavors. It was fun, but also kind of a gamble. Some people love that uncertainty, while others want to know what they're getting. Life is a bit like that, I suppose.
Original art. Not talking about spending hundreds on millions on getting one of the classics, but buying original art by artists that are somewhere between curated newcomer and established/well-known. Can be hit and miss. Not everyone's work they chose to collect will preserve value, or even increase in value. But once in a while, they get the chance to build a collection of somebody who will later explode in fame, value, and B. There seems to be a sense of satisfaction to sponsor the arts and individual artists. The rationale of the second point is maybe not completely different from sponsoring the sciences/libraries/museums, etc.
I once had a friend who collected original art. He focused on up-and-coming artists, which meant his collection was a bit of a gamble. Some pieces didn't hold value, but a few really took off. He enjoyed the thrill of discovering new talent, and liked feeling he was supporting artists directly. It was a neat way to engage with the art world without breaking the bank while also being part of something bigger.
This probably isn't as crazy as some people on this thread, but it was bizarre to me. I grew up poor, and I'm still fairly poor, but comfortable, $10 per hour job with 50-plus hours a week, but I make do. My mom and stepdad are well off. They are lead owners in many apartment complexes and just made a cap ton of money after selling one. As a celebratory, yay, we're millionaires. Hoorah, my mom took me out to get professionally fitted for a bra, and she bought me a few. Now, I've always worn the cheap $5 Walmart bras because that's all I can afford. My mom spent $176 on 3 bras without batting an eye. Who needs to spend $176 on bras? I could pay my car insurance and phone bill with that, but damn are they comfortable.
It's interesting how different people's views on spending can be. Like, I get wanting to treat yourself, but spending that much on bras just seems wild when you think about it. For some, it might not even be a big deal, but for others, it's like a whole month's worth of groceries. I guess the comfort factor really does matter though. At least you know your mom cares about treating you well.
For the record, most rich people don't live like this. You will find that a lot of families that have been rich for a long time don't spend like this. Buy cars and keep them till they fail. It might be a Mercedes, but they don't look to waste money on a bad investment and hand them down to their kids. The house might be in a nice neighborhood, but nothing too lavish or cost much to heat. Really, the one thing I find in common with wealthy families that don't spend much is that pay for the best education. Maybe even spending $30,000 a year on preschool.
Yeah, it's interesting how some rich families actually choose to live pretty frugally. I remember my friend's family. They drove the same old sedan for years, and their house was nice but not excessive. What really stood out was their commitment to education. They were always willing to invest in the best schools, even for their little kids. It's a different kind of wealth, focused more on long-term value than flashy spending.
I work for a company that sold kidnap insurance. Although the most interesting part is a majority of the time the person who is insured had no idea about it. For the people that do know and are going to a place with a high chance of being kidnapped, they're given some training on what to do. I got to spend one day trying to avoid getting kidnapped. We drove around in Manhattan in armored S-Class while random cars were the kidnappers. The instructor showed us what to look for and what to do in certain situations.
That's a wild job. Kidnap insurance sounds strange, especially since the insured often doesn't even know. The training must have been intense, though. Riding around in an armored car in Manhattan while playing dodgeball with kidnappers is a unique way to learn self-defense. It's interesting how they prepare people for situations like that. Makes you think about safety in a way most don't have to consider.
My father landed a job in Indonesia. When we moved there, we had to take out kidnapping insurance and have bodyguards with us when we went to school, any social event, only when dropping off and picking up, in order to minimize the amount of time we spent outside. Due to fear of being kidnapped, we had in-house employees who did the shopping. The house was guarded by 4 bodyguards at all times. Felt like a stronghold.
Sounds intense. Growing up with that level of security must have been strange. I mean, having bodyguards around all the time can't be easy, especially if you just wanted to hang out with friends. The whole thing feels like a movie plot, really. It's wild to think about how different life can be based on where you live. Pretty memorable though, I guess.
Now see, that's the kind of thing I would find creepy. The anonymous regularity of hotel rooms is something I actually find comforting because it says to me that the people that work there don't give a fuck about me or my stuff and aren't paying any more attention to it than they have to in order to do their jobs.
I get that. It's weird how some places can feel oddly comforting, even if they're not home. I remember staying in a hotel once, and it felt nice to know that the staff didn't care about my little mess. It's like you can just breathe and exist in your own space without worrying about judgment. Just a temporary spot, no strings attached.
I was a regular business flyer and in the top tier, fairly hard to get club member. Every time I flew, they had the meals I liked ready in the club room, reserved my preferred seat on the plane, and had my selection of meal ready. They even made sure to greet me by name when I boarded and have my take-off drink ready. It was nice to have a car pick me up from home, take me to the airport, and then I just got out and went through. They looked after bags, check-in, etc., and had a car waiting at the airport to take me to my hotel at the other end. I really was flying too much for work back then. I went from a new member to top tier in 4 months. It was a record, and they sent my wife a nice gift to celebrate.
Sounds like you had a solid setup as a frequent flyer. Getting the VIP treatment must have made those work trips a lot smoother. It's cool how they recognize your loyalty and even sent a gift to your wife. That kind of customer appreciation adds a nice touch. But yeah, flying all the time can get old pretty quick. Balancing work and travel isn't easy.
Disney parks have now changed their policies because of this. It used to be that disabled people and their families would go to the front of the line. Now the disabled people are offered an air-controlled area to wait in line, but not guaranteed a shorter wait. I used to be a Disney employee, and my aunt brought my 2 cousins to visit me while I was there. One of my cousins has a rare neurological disorder that, among other things, causes her to have seizures when she's in stressful environments, like Disney can be. The places they let us wait were nice, and it worked out great, but there were many more profoundly disabled people waiting with us that could have really benefited from shorter waits. It's a shame that rich people have ruined that for people who actually need it.
It's a tough situation. I remember my friend had a similar experience at a theme park with his brother, who has autism. They had to spend more time waiting, and it was stressful for everyone. It definitely seemed unfair that those who genuinely need help weren't prioritized. The new system might look better on paper, but it misses the mark for those who really need it. Sometimes, changes just make things harder.
My dad worked for that company, Chubb Insurance. In addition to fine art coverage, they offered specific rich people services like international business coverage, code for kidnapping insurance, coverage for collectible cars, watercraft, and employment practices liability for when the residential staff on your estate accuses you of sexual harassment.
That's an interesting take on insurance. It's crazy how some policies are designed for people with wealth and their unique problems. I can't imagine needing coverage for something like kidnapping or harassment claims from staff. It's a different world when your biggest worry is that kind of stuff. Makes you think about the privileges and issues that come with wealth.
Tax accountant here. When I started doing taxes for a living, my middle-income friends who all do their own taxes actually said to me, "Isn't your job kind of easy?" I do my own taxes with no problem. Yeah, sure, if you just have a W-2 and no home, that's easy. My clients have like 10K ones and multiple 50-page brokerage statements I have to comb through. It takes me about 20 hours to prepare their returns. There is nothing wrong with having someone do your taxes for you in that situation.
I get what you mean. People often underestimate the complexity of taxes. They look at their simple returns and think everyone has it easy. But dealing with multiple income sources and investments is a different story. It's a lot of work to ensure everything is accurate. It's kind of normal for your friends to think it's simple until they see the real deal. Having a pro helps them in the long run.
I remember some drama on a message board I frequented long ago, wherein a girl was complaining that there was no possible way she could live on the $2,000 a month her parents were giving her for food. I have to assume something like this was going on with her. I know she would only shop at a grocery store called AJ's Fine Foods. I believe they're local to Phoenix.
It's interesting how some people perceive money and budgeting. I once knew someone who had a similar mindset. They would always talk about how tough it was to make ends meet, even with a decent allowance. Shopping at places like AJ's definitely adds to the bill compared to regular stores. Just goes to show how different lifestyles can skew our views on money and what it takes to live.
I wouldn't say that's exclusively a rich thing. I have my pickup, which I drive mostly throughout the week, and then I have my 750 pounds MX-5 that I drive almost exclusively at the weekend. Also, a lot of older gentlemen do this. I know a lot of 50-plus wild men that own an old Lotus or MG and use it as their Sunday fun car.
That makes sense. Lots of people have their daily drivers and a fun car for the weekends. I used to know a guy who had this old convertible he took out on sunny days. He loved feeling the wind and just cruising around. It's nice how cars can have different purposes for different people. Makes the whole driving experience more interesting.
I always felt horrible growing up in NYC because everyone seemed so fucking rich, except poor me. It really grated on me. But a friend of mine reminded me that I was seeing a completely skewed version of life because the wealth is so concentrated here. An hour outside of New York was way different than the UES. Bergdorf's and Madison Avenue were not the center of the universe.
I hear you. Growing up in a city like NYC can make you feel out of place. It's easy to forget that there's a whole world beyond the wealthy areas. That friend sounds wise, pointing out how skewed our perspective can get. Reality shifts pretty quickly just outside the city limits. It's interesting how we often focus on the flashy stuff and overlook the bigger picture. Life's a lot more varied than it seems at first glance.
When I was working at a cellular provider in support, I got a call from a personal assistant to a company president about the boss's phone cutting out in the middle of calls. Looked up the phone model, it was a Vertu. Did a search on the network for errors with the same brand, and found out these suck-ass at handling handovers from tower to tower. Informed the assistant. He wasn't very jolly about the prospect of informing his too-important-to-call-to-support himself boss that his $10,000 phone is basically a nice-looking piece of garbage.
I once had a similar situation at a tech support job. A client called in, frustrated about his device dropping calls. Turns out, it was a high-end model known for its design rather than functionality. I had to break it to him that the premium price didn't equal better performance. His reaction was pretty similar to that assistant's. Sometimes, people just can't handle the reality of pricey gadgets being less than perfect.
I remember my parents had some old friends that lived on the good side of the city. Not super rich, but well off and in a very good neighborhood. They had some extremely soft, pink toilet paper. Not really all that weird, but I have never seen that kind in stores ever. They always had it. I'm sure they got it from a local convenience store. Just weird to me to think about that luxury toilet paper that is only sold in the good part of the city.
That's an interesting detail about the toilet paper. It's funny how those little things stick with you. I guess it shows how some neighborhoods have their own vibes and little luxuries. It makes you think about how different lifestyles can be, even with something as simple as bathroom supplies. Just a reminder that what seems ordinary for some can be pretty unique for others.
Makes me imagine that there are probably a few more wealthy people who choose to live modestly. They may be worth millions of dollars, but it's hardly obvious, and it's on purpose because they don't want to be known for their money. Because to be honest, I think that if I had that kind of money and I could, that's what I would do. You don't want family and friends clamoring for your money. You want people you can actually connect with and enjoy you for you. If you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of rich folks probably prefer to stay low-key. It's like, why deal with all the attention and expectations? I get wanting genuine connections over superficial ones. It's nice to think about living simply while still having the means. Plus, keeping it chill means less stress and more freedom to just be yourself. Can't blame them for that choice.
It's another one of those vocal minority things. People notice the guy driving down the street in a chrome Lamborghini, but don't notice the guy that makes twice as much driving an old Honda. They then associate wealth with the ones they notice, and we get those annoying stereotypes that are usually from new money trying to be impressive, but not always.
Yeah, it's funny how people fixate on flashy stuff. You see someone in a sports car and immediately think they're rich. Meanwhile, the real wealthy ones often just blend in. I remember my friend who's loaded but drives some beat-up old sedan. He's all about keeping it low-key. It's interesting how perception shapes our views, but in the end, it's just surface level. Everyone's got their own story, you know?
Heated floors are common obviously, at least here in Canada, But I was in a home recently that had a cool application. They had a space by the front door that was heated slate tiles, the purpose of which being that if you left your wet shoes sitting on the tiles when you take them off, they dry faster, and the water that comes off of them just evaporates off the tile. No messy rugs or those little trays for snow boots. Just mop or Swiffer over it every now and then to get the salt or whatnot. Heated driveways are becoming more common, especially with solar catching on more. In my area, I could easily imagine it as a feature in homes starting around $750,000, which isn't too huge. It's obviously big money, but it's not like you're in the millionaires only club.
That's a pretty practical setup. I get how heated floors make life easier, especially in a snowy place like Canada. That heated slate by the door seems like a smart way to manage wet shoes without the mess. It's cool how heated driveways are becoming more common too. That price point doesn't seem too outrageous for a home feature nowadays. Makes sense to invest in comfort if you're already spending on a house.
If I were that dude, I'd build a false identity and go live in it. I mean, buy a modest house on a pleasant street and get a 5-year-old domestic car and spend weekends and odd weekdays they're associating with the neighbors. Just make up some story about why you're away as often as you are. Try to get the next door neighbor to introduce you to people and hang out at the bowling alley or whatever. We're a Timex. Take up a hobby where people get excited over like car parts rather than buying whole luxury cars. You know, secret millionaire stuff.
That does sound like an interesting plan. I once knew a guy who moved to a small town and just blended in. He got a regular job, joined a local club, and basically became part of the community. No one expected much, but he had a different life hidden away. It was cool to see how people connected with him, not knowing his real story. Sometimes a fresh start has its own charm.
Not a joke. My cousin was working in Mexico and got kidnapped. He was insured and not sure if the company bought the policy or if he bought it on his own. The best part was the insurance company sent a team of negotiators, etc. So the family doesn't deal with the local police or figure out what to do beyond call the insurance company and let the professionals handle it. It took about a week to get him back, unharmed.
That's a wild story. It's good to hear he came back safe. Insurance can sometimes seem like a waste, but moments like that show its value. Having professionals handle the situation must have taken a lot off the family's shoulders. Crazy how things can turn so quickly in another country. Glad it worked out in the end.
She probably didn't even have any food in the house. Just spent it all on eating out. I could feed my family of 3 on $2,000 a month shopping exclusively at Balducci's, with money left over. But if you've never had to figure out how to manage a budget, you're not going to magically start doing it when you get your own place. Especially if you're playing with someone else's money.
It's interesting how some people manage their money. I had a friend who always chose takeout over cooking. They thought it was easier, but when bills came, it hit hard. Living on your own means understanding priorities. My family had to learn budgeting early on, and it made things simpler. You don't realize how important those skills are until you're dealing with your own expenses.
That's pretty bad. This sort of thing is mostly unheard of in Australia. It was a big news story and everything. USYD is very difficult to get into, and kids who worked hard to get the required ADR for their desired course, including myself, were pretty angry to learn that there were other students who didn't have to put an ounce of effort into year 12 because they were rich.
Yeah, that situation is pretty frustrating. I remember my friend getting all worked up when a wealthy student got into their dream school without much effort. It felt unfair since we all know how hard some people grind to earn their spots. It's a tough reality when money seems to outweigh hard work in education, especially in a place like Australia where you expect merit to matter most.
When I was growing up, my grandfather had a ranch and a ranch hand to go with it. The hand and his family lived free in a house on the land and was paid a smallish wage. The hand started off as illegal, so Grandpa lawyered him up and helped him get his citizenship. He helped put the hand's son through AG school, too. When Grandpa died, we inherited the ranch, but not the surf. He went to work in town, I think. But, funnily enough, I grew up running around with the hand's kid, Cleo, playing in the pastures and fields, etc. when I was visiting during the summers and holidays. Didn't ever think of him as a serf until now. Edit, in retrospect, it was Cleo, which is still a weird name for a little boy.
It's interesting how we perceive people when we're kids. I remember playing around with my neighbor, not really thinking much about their background or situation. We were just kids having fun, running around without a care. Looking back, I see things differently now. Those experiences shaped me. It's a reminder that sometimes the labels we put on people don't matter much when you're just enjoying life. Cleo seems like a unique name for that time.
I think the problem is how squishy they are. I've picked raspberries, and if you get more than a few inches of them in a container, they start squashing the bottom layer, and you need to freeze them or make jam that same day. I imagine that to guarantee they can be transported, raspberries need to be packed in the half-pint containers. Source: my family grows raspberries and blackberries, and there are wild black raspberries in the area.
I get that. Raspberries are really delicate. I remember helping a friend pick them once. We had a whole bucket full, but by the time we got home, a bunch were squished. We had to make jam that night just to save them. It's kind of a hassle, but the fresh jam is worth it. Just gotta be careful with how you handle them.
Meet the right people. I used to work on-site tech support at a big box store. When I left, 3 of my clients tracked me down through relatives. The joys of an uncommon family name. I didn't really want to freelance since I have a well-paying full-time IT gig, but they were insistent and asked what rate I wanted to freelance for them. I threw them an absurd rate, expecting them to turn it down. 2 of them accepted. Now about once a month, I have a few-hour job to do that covers my car payments.
That's a solid story. It shows how connections can lead to unexpected opportunities. Even when you're not looking, people remember your work. Freelancing on the side is nice too, especially when it pays for something essential like car payments. It's good to have that flexibility without leaving your main job. It's funny how things work out sometimes.
New Jersey. They make it all kinds of ways. Some commute to Wall Street. Some are retired, some simply inherited it. Most of them are owners of companies or owners of large franchises of big companies. There is even one very, very well-known rock star that lives 5 houses down. I'd love not to give up my address, but his name is at least as big as, say, Lenny Kravitz.
Sounds like a pretty interesting place, New Jersey. A mix of people doing their thing, from Wall Street folks to retirees. I wonder what it's like to live next to someone famous. Must be nice, but also a bit strange. You'd probably run into them at the store or something. Just sharing the space with that much talent. It's like a little piece of fame in the neighborhood.
Not the person you're applying to, but I lived in such an area as kid. It happens a lot of time as an accident of geography or politics. Bits of land sometimes get assigned to a municipality for reasons of convenience, and the economic divide deepens over time. So you end up with upper middle class folks like doctors and lawyers in the same place as some pretty obscenely rich people. These days, everyone has the internet to compare tax rates to school quality, though, so they're probably dying out.
I can relate to that. I grew up in a neighborhood with a mix of different incomes. It was interesting seeing how people interacted despite their backgrounds. Some families were really well off, while others were just getting by. It was a unique dynamic. As times changed and people could easily compare their situations online, I noticed the community shift a bit. It felt like everyone was more aware of the differences.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.